The purpose of this video is to make the case for free markets. And free markets are an important part of populist conservatism because they bring power to the individual. Think about it this way. Under socialism, a central planner says, you'll have 7 pairs of socks and you'll like it. But under free markets, someone who wears flip-flops all winter may not need 7 pairs of socks. And someone who works out a lot may need a lot more than 7 pairs of socks. So even in this very trivial example, free markets bring power to the individual, and yet the closer you get to socialism, the more power you're giving to elite intellectuals to make decisions for the rest of society. The economist Stephen Landsberg states that most of economics can be summarized in 4 words. People respond to incentives. The rest is commentary. And he's absolutely right. An incentive is just a reason to do something. Getting paid is an incentive to go to your job every day. Having clean clothes is an incentive to do the laundry. And having a healthy marriage is an incentive to treat your wife with kindness and respect. A very common economic lessons that conservatives repeatedly use is don't look at the intentions of a policy, look at the incentives of a policy. A related concept is punishment and reward. So if you want to understand how a government policy affects behavior, look at what is punished and look at what's rewarded. So my dog Josh won't jump up onto the counter because he knows he'll be scolded. That scolding changes my dog's incentive. He has an incentive to jump up on the counter in order to grab a piece of chicken. But knowing that he's going to be scolded changes the incentives. Getting a chicken plus a scolding is no longer worth it for him. The government changes the incentives of our policies all the time with punishment and reward, but only rarely are these punishments and rewards the intended goal of a policy. For example, sin taxes on cigarettes and alcohol are not intended to raise money, their intention is to deter smoking and drinking. Similarly, the goal of the home mortgage deduction is to change people's behavior, to encourage people to buy houses. That creates stable neighborhoods, it creates stability for children, it develops social capital and cohesiveness within localized communities. Punishment and reward is a very important lens through which to view our government policies, and it gives rise to a common slogan in economic circles. You get less of what you tax and more of what you subsidize. We tax cigarettes so we get less cigarette smoking, we subsidize home buying so we get higher rates of home ownership. Unfortunately, the vast majority of our government policies are based on good intentions, not a hard-headed analysis of the incentives. And what happens in that case is what economists call the law of unintended consequences. The economist James Gortney has one of my favorite examples in his book Common Sense Economics. In the former Soviet Union, managers and employees of glass plants were at one time rewarded according to the tons of glass sheet they produced. Because their revenues depended on the weight of the glass, most factories produced sheet glass so thick that you could hardly see through it. The rules were changed so that managers were compensated according to the number of square meters of glass they could produce. Under these rules, Soviet firms made glass so thin that it broke easily. Communism is essentially a witch's brew of good intentions mixed with bad incentives. Let's take a look at Karl Marx's famous slogan, "From each according to their ability, to each according to their need." That's a good way to express the spirit of communism, but now let's look at it through the lens of punishment and reward. What is punished? Hard work, because workers wouldn't make any extra money no matter how much extra work they did. And what's rewarded? Being lazy and shirking on the job, because you still get an equal share no matter how much you shirk. Just based on our analysis of incentives, we would predict that communism destroys the work ethic and makes people lazy, and that's exactly what we've seen. The economist John Macmillan explains in the book Reinventing the Bizarre. Communist China put Marx's slogan into practice. What they did was they nationalized all the farms so that the peasants worked them collectively. So people who worked hard got just as much food as people who shirked. And sure enough, the outcome was a lot more shirking. And since no one wants to be the only sucker, even the hard workers started shirking too when they saw what everyone else was doing. The Chinese Anhui province was known as the Granary of China, but after communism, things got so bad that the people couldn't even feed themselves. In fact, they were tragically forced to resort to cannibalism, and the cannibalism was so severe that what they did was they essentially had to trade dead children with neighboring families because no one wanted to eat their own children. So If you ever run into a leftist who wants to champion communism, just tell them about the Anhui province of China and their experiments with it. In 1978, people from the Zhaigang village met in secret, and what they decided to do was to divide the commune into privately owned lots, one lot for each family. So basically what they did is they switched back to capitalism from communism, and once they did that, their harvest skyrocketed. As one farmer explained, "You can't be lazy when you work for your family and yourself." Neighboring villages saw their success, and they switched to private property, and the practice began to spread more and more widely throughout China. Luckily for the villagers, this happened at a time when the old guard in the Communist Party was being challenged. The reformers allowed the experiments to continue, and by 1984 there were no communes left. The lesson is that communism is the world's most powerful system for creating poverty, and capitalism is the world's most powerful system for creating wealth. You sometimes hear leftists who argue that capitalism only benefits the rich, but next time you run into one of those leftists, I would recommend bringing up the Chinese peasants who were forced to trade dead children with their neighbors so that they would have something to eat. Now, it's very easy to pick on communism, and I do plan to do it regularly, but leftists in the United States aren't a whole lot better. So let's look at a couple examples where leftists ignored the incentives of a policy and thereby ran afoul of the law of unintended consequences. The first is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It had very good intentions. It was designed to boost unemployment for the disabled, and the way they did that was by requiring workplaces to be more accessible. However, the incentives were quite different, because making workplaces accessible costs money. Research by Darren Asimoglu and Joshua Angrish shows that the act actually caused a drop in employment for the disabled. Moreover, this drop was concentrated in medium-sized firms, and there's a good reason for that. Large firms could afford to make the accommodations for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and small firms were exempted from the act, but medium-sized firms were just stuck in a bind, and so what they did was they just started to refuse to hire disabled workers. Here's a second example of leftists ignoring the law of unintended consequences. In the late 1990s, federal regulations for student loans were weakened, and according to research by Adam Loney and Konstantin Yanelis, this actually resulted in harming less skilled workers. The weaker regulations did lead to more students going to college, but it was relatively weak students who could only get into poor-performing, low-value institutions. And most of these students failed to complete a degree, struggled to repay their loans, and defaulted at high rates, and didn't have much success on the job market. So the end result of all this was workers not getting a degree, but being stuck with student loan debt. So now that we have a basic understanding of incentives, let's take a look at the invisible hand and supply and demand. The basic idea of the invisible hand is that the pursuit of self-interest through free markets leads to the greater good for society as a whole. One of the great things about economics is even the most complex lessons can be taught with a simple parable. And so the economist Walter Williams gives us our first parable in our tour of economics. In Hurricane Isabel's wake, private contractors from nearby states brought their heavy equipment to Virginia to clear fallen trees from people's houses. Producers and shippers of generators, plywood, and other vital supplies worked overtime to increase the flow of these goods to Virginians. What was it that got these people and millions of others to help their fellow man in a time of need? Was it admonitions from George Bush? Was it conscience or love of one's fellow man? I'll tell you what it was. It was rising prices and the opportunity for people to cash in on windfall profits. The great thing about this parable is that it teaches everything you need to know about supply and demand, and it does so using an example that should be rigged against free markets, the case of price gouging after a hurricane. It's relatively easy to defend free markets in times when things are going smoothly and prices are low, but we're really putting our back up against a wall to defend free markets when prices are high. There are three great virtues to letting supply and demand determine the price for a good, even in times of stress like a hurricane, and this parable teaches all three of those virtues. The first virtue is that prices are an incentive to increase the supply. Think about what Virginia was like after the hurricane hit. There were a lot of people with damaged homes, and they'd be willing to pay a lot of money to get their house fixed as soon as possible. So the first few contractors to pack up all their heavy equipment and get to Virginia would make windfall profits. But after a whole bunch of contractors moved to Virginia, and after that initial wave of demand was met, prices were going to come back down really quickly. So windfall profits are not inherently bad. They're an incentive to increase the supply, and as soon as supply comes into equilibrium with the demand again, price comes back down. The second great virtue of the price system is that prices ration demand. Now the word ration is usually a bad word, but the fact of the matter is we can't have unlimited amounts of everything we want. A global revolution to worldwide communism is not going to put more oil or steel under the ground. So under socialism, central planners do the rationing. Under free markets, people do their own rationing. Let's take two fictional people, Alicia and Blake, and let's suppose that the hurricane damaged Alicia's house, but Blake's garage. So with price as a rationing system, Alicia will decide that she really does need to pay that price gouging rate to get her house fixed as quickly as possible. But Blake will decide that he doesn't actually want to pay that high price, and he's just going to wait till that first wave of demand is met and prices come back down again. Once that happens, he can have his garage fixed at the normal rate. And here's the great thing for Blake, that actually happened sooner than it would have because you had all those out-of-state contractors move in to help people like Alicia. Those out-of-state contractors very quickly met the pent-up demand for heavy contracting work, and so Blake was actually able to get his garage fixed quite quickly. Now imagine if Virginia had a law on the books against price gouging so that you couldn't raise the prices. Then all the heavy contractors would have stayed home, and that pent-up demand would take forever to fix. There'd be a backlog that probably lasted for years and years before contractors finally got through it all. And so what contractors would do is they'd just put everybody on a wait list and then just take people off the wait list. And so Blake could very easily have gotten on the wait list before Alicia, and he'd have his garage fixed before Alicia got her house fixed. So once again, we see the wisdom of using price as a rationing system. Blake had less need because it was only his garage that was damaged, so he decided to sit out that initial rush, and Alicia, who had greater need, was able to get a contractor right away. Now let's look at the third great virtue of the price system. Prices broadcast information. So all local contractors had to do was check the going rate for contracting services to see how much demand or how much unmet demand there was in Virginia. And as soon as those prices started to come down, they knew that supply and demand had come back into equilibrium again, and they should pack back up and move home. By contrast, under communism, you'd have to have a whole bunch of agents of the government going around doing surveys of how many people's houses had been damaged, how many heavy contractors there were out there, how many machines and employees they had, and then coming up with estimates of how much work could be done in a given period of time and how long it would take to clear all that work out. So in the real world, information is not free. Getting information costs time and it costs money. But under capitalism, getting the price is pretty close to free, and it made it very easy for contractors to see what was going on with supply and demand in Virginia. Under communism, that information is extremely expensive and extremely slow to acquire. Virtually everything you need to know about supply and demand is found in the parable of the price gougers and the hurricane. Now it's just a matter of teaching that exact same lesson over and over again until it becomes automatic. So let's take a couple of examples. The first example is middlemen. No one likes middlemen, but they perform a valuable service. Suppose that the price of rice is $2 per pound in North Carolina and $7 per pound in California. An enterprising middleman could buy rice in North Carolina where it is cheap and then sell it to California. So this would drive down the price of rice in California and make it more affordable. So let's think about this in terms of incentives. The middleman is motivated by windfall profits, and he gets his windfall profits by shipping rice to California. But he's also benefiting consumers in California by bringing down the price of rice there, where it's scarce and prices have gone really high. He might even be alleviating a severe famine in California, in which case he's doing a lot of good for consumers there. This process of taking goods from where the price is low and selling it to where price is high is called arbitrage. I'll give a few examples of arbitrage from the real world. One comes from a former slave who purchased his own freedom and became a leading abolitionist. His name was Olaudah Equiano. and he was a Nigerian boy who was captured at age 11 and sold into slavery, and he ended up being put to work on a ship sailing from island to island in the Caribbean. But he noticed that the price of certain goods, such as fruit, were higher on some islands than others, and he was allowed to engage in his own trade and ultimately able to make enough money to purchase his freedom and get an education. And he would go on to write a book called The Interesting Narrative in the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavo Vassa, the African, and it became a classic abolitionist text. The cowboys were another real-world example of arbitrage. So after the Civil War, ranchers discovered that a longhorn steer worth $4 in Texas was worth $40 in the North. So every year, cowboys would drive hundreds of thousands of cattle along iconic routes like the Chisholm Trail to a railway stop in Abilene, Texas. Then the cattle would be put on the railway and sent to slaughterhouses in Chicago or to the east. A fun fact about the cowboys is they were a racially integrated profession. It was a very dangerous job and it required skilled hands, so no one would turn down a skilled cowboy because they were black or Native American or Hispanic. Arbitrage can also happen over time instead of over distances, although in that case we call it speculation. Suppose that a speculator thinks the wheat harvest is going to be bad. What that means is that in the future, there isn't going to be a whole lot of wheat out there, which means that the price of wheat is going to rise. So what he does is buys existing wheat from the current harvest and then stores it in warehouses for a while until the next harvest comes out and the price of wheat starts to rise. At that point, he takes wheat out of his warehouses and sells it in the future. So in the process, he makes windfall profits for himself, but he also alleviates a potential famine by taking wheat out of circulation when there's plenty of food in the current harvest and selling it in the future in the bad harvest. Now, modern commodities markets are a bit more complex than what I've just explained here, but the core principle still applies. The movie The Big Short does an entertaining job telling the stories of speculators who bet on the collapse of the housing market. So basically what they thought is that housing was overpriced and that its prices would soon come down. So they started selling housing short, and the way they did that was with the credit default swaps that you may have heard about if you can remember the housing bubble of 2008. So the speculators made a lot of money when they were proven right, but they also deflated the housing bubble. So the housing bubble, when it burst, did a lot of damage to a lot of people, but if it had continued to inflate for another year or 2 or 3 years, then it would have done even more damage. So the speculators who bought these credit default swaps were the early warning system that deflated this bubble earlier than it might have otherwise happened. Speculation isn't always good, and the only reason the housing bubble happened in the first place was because other people were speculating that houses would continue to rise. Now, I know there's a lot of libertarians and staunch economic conservatives who think that bubbles cannot happen in the free market, and instead bubbles are the result of an inflationary Federal Reserve policy or some other government action. So I'll give 2 quick arguments against this. The first is the tulip bubble of 1637. It happened in the Dutch Republic, and so I have to give a mini history lesson here. The Dutch Republic was formed in 1581, and their official religion was Calvinism. So once again, we see Protestant Christianity, and in particular Calvinism, playing an early role in nations forming republics long before any secular movement like the French Revolution. Now, in the Dutch Republic, you did have to be a Calvinist to hold public office, but otherwise they had pretty widespread religious tolerance in 1581. And you compare that to the French Revolution, which came along 200 years later, and after a brief flirtation with religious tolerance, they began a program of de-Christianization. So you see once again that Christianity, and in particular Protestant and Calvinist Christianity, has been far ahead of secularism in terms of items like freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So the Dutch Republic allowed free speech, and they published all the books that various kings in other countries had banned because they threatened the king. So the Dutch Republic became an essential place for most intellectuals to spend part of their careers, and John Locke himself spent part of his career here prior to the Glorious Revolution in England. So Holland became a very wealthy nation, and as they became wealthy, they began to develop a fondness for expensive luxury goods, and that included tulips. You might wonder how tulips could be an expensive luxury good, but they were infected with a certain disease called tulip breaking disease, and they led to really vivid and unique mosaic patterns on the tulip bulbs. And so tulips from prized lineages with particularly striking patterns became extraordinarily valuable, and they were bred like modern racehorses. And that's what set off the tulip bubble. Now, I think it's safe to say that the tulip bubble was not caused by an inflationary Federal Reserve or any big government policies. So bubbles can happen anywhere where there is legitimate uncertainty about the value of a good, whether that's housing in 2008 or tulips in 1637. The second line of evidence that speculation can cause bubbles independent of any big government type program comes from the discipline of experimental economics. And that's when college professors get their economics students to play economic games in simulated markets like the New York Stock Exchange. And Ronald King reviewed the research on experimental markets, and he found that bubbles are a nearly universal phenomenon of all experimental markets. As long as you are allowed to flip something and sell it for more money, you're going to get bubbles. The best way to understand the power of free markets is to look at what happens when you don't have a free market. Now, imagine that a city, perhaps in the Bay Area like San Francisco, gets a large number of newcomers. You'll have a lot more people bidding for the same supply of housing, so what will happen is the price of housing will go up. With free markets, that's a short-term problem, and hopefully at this point you understand why. Yes, the price of housing goes up initially, but landlords will rush to build new housing developments because the first few landlords to build new housing will make windfall profits. But as more and more landlords make more and more housing, eventually supply and demand come into equilibrium again, and the price of housing will drop, and so the rent will drop. But what happens if politicians get impatient and intervene before this process happens? That's what rent control does. Rent control is laws that make it illegal to raise the price of rent. The outcome of rent control is a series of downstream consequences. The first downstream consequence is a reduction in the supply of apartments. Landlords won't build new apartments since they can't make any money from them, and they'll probably even take existing units off the market. Now, rent control laws generally make this legal, but there's always loopholes like declaring bankruptcy or reserving apartments for a family member. The second downstream consequence is an increase in the demand for apartments. So, because the price is very low, there's not going to be an incentive to ration or to economize on apartments. So renters will look for a one-bedroom instead of a studio, or a two-bedroom instead of a one-bedroom. Empty nesters will keep the same apartment they've always rented instead of moving into a smaller place. Lower rents also make people less likely to look for a roommate to live with. The root cause of the apartment problem was that demand was high and supply was low, and yet rent control made the supply even lower and the demand even higher, so it made the root cause of the problem even more severe. This then leads to the next downstream consequence, which is shortages. Landlords get many applicants for every vacant apartment. That's a big problem, and it leads to an even bigger problem, which is discrimination. Racist landlords can take their pick from many applicants, so they can choose only to rent to white people. Free markets don't have this problem because landlords can't count on immediately renting a vacant apartment. Turning down a qualified black applicant may mean having to leave the apartment vacant for a month or two until a qualified white applicant comes along. Now, there are a lot of racists in this world, but not many of them are willing to give up thousands of dollars in order to indulge their racism. Even landlords who aren't racist would prefer to rent to affluent middle-class professionals, and the data backs this up. Research by Rolf Getz has found that rent-controlled apartments were concentrated among educated professionals. And this leads to an important point. Sometimes progressives argue that the government is needed to reduce the power of the wealthy and bolster the power of the poor and working class. And in some cases that may even be true, but in other cases it's the exact opposite, and that's what we see in rent control. It harms the poor and working class and amplifies the power of the wealthy. So if the poor can't get rent-controlled apartments, what do? Research by William Tucker has shown that rent control leads to higher rates of homelessness. Of course, that's an extreme case. What really tends to happen in the more usual cases is that poor and working class renters are forced into a gray market, which is not governed by rent control laws. Some landlords, particularly on an informal basis, will rent apartments under the table. And that includes people who rent spare rooms, condos, and in-law apartments. And local governments usually allow this gray market because first, they're very hard to police, and secondly, they relieve the apartment shortage that was created by rent control. Other times, landlords are simply given an exemption from rent control if that will induce them to build new apartments. However, this gray market is really important to understand. It's not a true free market. It's got limited amounts of competition. And because it's only got limited amounts of competition, it doesn't drive down prices the way a true free market does. Once again, William Tucker's research shows that apartments in this gray market are more expensive than apartments in cities that do not have rent control. Another downstream consequence of rent control is a decline in quality. And since landlords can't make much money on their apartments, they have to find ways to cut corners and save costs. So they skip on basics like paint and maintenance in order to make even a small profit. Walter Block reviews the research on rent control and finds that 29% of rent-controlled apartments in the United States were in a state of disrepair, compared to only 8% in places without rent control. If the drop in quality is minor, then affluent professionals can take care of it themselves. If the drop in quality is severe, it can lead to slums. The paint starts peeling, broken windows get boarded up, the brickwork begins to crumble, and the graffiti doesn't get washed away. That's when the affluent professionals move out of the rent-controlled apartments and into luxury apartments that are legally exempt from rent control. Then the poor and working class are pushed into rent-controlled slums. The Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck once said that the surest way to destroy a city, aside from bombing, is rent control. Rent control is what happens when the government lowers the price of rent below where it would be set by free market forces and supply and demand. Minimum wage is the opposite. It's what happens when the government raises the price of labor for unskilled workers above what it would be set by free markets and supply and demand. And so minimum wage laws also have a series of harmful downstream consequences. But that's not what makes minimum wage laws important. Minimum wage laws are important because they are a textbook example of how the left can use some extremely sophisticated economic reasoning in defense of some very bad policies. The main contention of the left is that minimum wage is not accurately described by the Economics 101 reasoning. Instead, it's much more complicated, and because of these other market frictions at work, you can actually have minimum wage laws that help unskilled workers without causing an increase in unemployment. And this reasoning is what gave way to the rise of $15 and even $20 minimum wage laws in blue states and California. So let's take a look at the debate over minimum wage. Let's start with the standard Economics 101 reasoning. Suppose the free market had come up with a $10 an hour wage for unskilled workers, and a minimum wage law is passed that raises it to $15. So that immediately does two things. The first is that it results in a drop in demand for unskilled labor because the price has gone up. Suppose you own a firm and you've got a certain job, like say bagging groceries, that provides $12 an hour worth of value. Then you'll hire someone to bag your groceries for you at your grocery store if there is no minimum wage, or if the minimum wage is only $10 an hour. But if the minimum wage rises up to $15 an hour, then that's just a job you're not going to fill, and you're just going to let people bag their own groceries, which is what you tend to see in Europe, by the way. Europe, which has higher minimum wages, does not have a lot of these sort of low, unskilled jobs that proliferate in the United States, such as grocery bagger and someone who busses tables at a restaurant. The second thing about minimum wage laws is they increase the supply of unskilled labor. So a lot of teenagers can freely enter and exit the workforce, and they may choose to enter the workforce with a $15 minimum wage law, because for them, working for $15 an hour makes sense. Working for $10 an hour means they'd rather do homework, watch TV, or hang out with their friends. So the goal of minimum wage is not to help middle-class teenagers, it's to help truly unskilled workers, and yet now they've got a lot of competition from teenagers who have been induced to enter the workforce. So what happens when there's an increase in supply and a drop in demand? The outcome is surpluses, labor that no one wants to hire. And economists have a special term for a surplus of labor: unemployment. So an Economics 101 model predicts that minimum wage laws increase the unemployment of low-skilled and unskilled workers. The next downstream consequence of minimum wage laws is an increase in the quality of workers, which in a vacuum seems like a really good thing. But remember that the goal of minimum wage laws is to help truly unskilled workers, such as high school dropouts. So think about it this way. If you are running a firm, you could hire 3 workers at $10 an hour who are low quality workers, or you could hire 2 medium quality workers at $15 an hour. And the $15 workers will do as much as the 3 $10 workers. You can call this the Costco effect, or maybe these days the Chick-fil-A effect, which is within the pool of unskilled workers, workers are not homogeneous. Some are very friendly, have excellent social skills, and are very conscientious. The only thing that all unskilled workers have in common is a lack of certifiable trades or education. So businesses like Costco and In-N-Out Burger and Chick-fil-A, they provide their high-quality experience by cream skimming the best of these workers by offering somewhat higher pay. And so that's great for the high-quality workers who get the higher pay, but it's not so good for the unskilled worker, the high school dropout, who's just not going to get these jobs. And so minimum wage laws force everybody to follow the Costco and In-N-Out Burger model of hiring premium unskilled workers. And that's the gist of the Economics 101 case against the minimum wage. What it does is it creates unemployment, and that this unemployment is concentrated among workers at the bottom end of the economic ladder, so minorities and high school dropouts, for example. But it can be beneficial for the middle-class teenagers who want to work and make a little extra money while they're in high school. That consensus changed in 1994 when 2 economists named David Card and Alan Kruger published a very famous study. Now, before I get into the study, I need to say something about the economics profession. For a long time, they had done themselves a major disservice by ignoring real-world data and instead focusing on armchair reasoning from first principles like supply and demand. Now, they didn't do it the way that I've done it in this video, by sort of reasoning through how supply and demand worked. Instead, they put this all into mathematical models and made it far more rigorous, but it's still a mathematical model that's completely divorced from the real world. The economist Samuel Bowles divides economists into 2 categories, the priests and the engineers. The priests are the ones who sit in their armchairs and do fancy mathematics like separating hyperplanes in order to reason about how the price system works. And the engineers are the ones who get their hands dirty collecting data. And Card and Kruger are in the engineer category, and that is the good category, and that is where economics needed to go. You've probably heard that a randomized controlled trial is the gold standard for scientific research. And in a randomized controlled trial, what that means is that half the subjects are randomized to be in a treatment group, and the other half are randomized to be into a control group. And then you apply the treatment effect, and if you see differences between these 2 groups, then you know it must be because of the treatment, at least if you get a large enough statistical sample size. I'm sure economists would love to have the power to make laws and start doing randomized controlled trials on the world, but they haven't been given that power yet. And so when you can't do a randomized controlled trial, you look for the next best thing, and that's called a natural experiment, and that's exactly what Card and Kruger found. They looked at fast food restaurants on either side of the border between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and New Jersey raised their minimum wage. So what they got was a natural version of this random controlled trial. Namely, New Jersey raising their minimum wage and acting as the treatment group, and Pennsylvania, which didn't, acting as the control group. And they found no difference in unemployment rates between these 2 states after the change in the minimum wage. This led to a new economic consensus that the minimum wage doesn't neatly fit into an Economics 101 paradigm, and instead there are various market frictions at work, such as monopsony power of firms, efficiency wages, and search and matching costs. Now, I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole on those things, but they're there if you want to do that. However, since then the research has been moving back into a somewhat more nuanced version of the Economics 101 paradigm. And the leaders here have been 2 economists named David Newmark and William Washer. And they did a whole bunch of research on minimum wage, including looking at actual payroll receipts in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, as well as doing a bunch of meta-analysis. And from their pushback, we can really draw four main patterns from minimum wage laws. The first is that minimum wage laws do not treat all workers as a single homogeneous group. Instead, you've got to look at the subgroups of minimum wage workers. And it is the case that minorities and high school dropouts have been harmed by minimum wages, and they're basically kept off the bottom rung of the employment ladder. And if you're kept off the bottom rung of the employment ladder, it's very hard to build up a resume and prove yourself. So the minimum wage laws that were targeting people like minorities and high school dropouts actually harmed them, which again, this is another major lesson for the left. You're trying to help the poor and you're trying to help minorities, and instead you're actively harming them with poorly designed policies. Another lesson is that fast food workers should be thought of as outliers among minimum wages, because fast food restaurants are national chains and they can invest very heavily into automation. But automation does take some time to show up, and it takes time for those changes to manifest over time. And fast food places are also relatively high ranking by minimum wage standards, so they can afford to hire those high school teenagers who will probably turn into accountants and doctors and white collar workers at some point, as opposed to the workers really at the bottom of the economic ladder. And the final lesson is that there is some truth to Card&Krueger's original research that small increases in the minimum wage do not raise unemployment. And you simply can't defend these $15 and $20 minimum wage laws off of Card&Krueger's research, which is a point Card&Krueger themselves have made. They are far more nuanced and thoughtful about their research than the progressives who have run with it. And David Card in particular has distanced himself from this original research. And here's the most important final takeaway of minimum wage research, which is this. There are a lot of very economically sophisticated leftists out there. And if they want to find a reason why a given market deviates from a very simple economics 101 paradigm, they're going to find it. Real world is way too complicated, and economics 101 is a model. It's not a perfect description of reality. But if you use these imperfections as a reason to start having ham-handed government interference in the economy, you're going to make things worse, not better. And that's a lesson I wish progressives would learn, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that. So that's the gist of the case for free markets, but we're not done with economics for a while yet. In the next video, I'm going to defend monopolies and oligopolies. Oligopolies are markets dominated by a small number of firms, and we'll see that they're actually much more efficient and much better for consumers than markets with perfect competition and hundreds of firms competing with each other. And we're also going to learn the most important lesson, arguably in all of economics, the virtue of failure.